So I decided to start the slide with the blue and red blob here because I'm seismologist, but actually this blue and red blobs are not velocity structure here. It's actually showing you postseismic deformation following deep earthquake. And that's what I would like to talk about today, with the subtitle being a new window into rheological structure of the mantle. This work is in collaboration with Jean-Philippe Avoac and Zhongwen Zhan at Caltech and Adriano Gualandi at INGV, and also Chao Zhang, which he is a student of mine in my group at the University of Chicago. I also have subtitle, which is basically going after something that might not be observable at all. So I would like to talk about the mantle viscosity, which you can understand as resistance to flow. Understanding mantle viscosity structure is crucial since it basically controls the pattern and rate of the mantle convection. It's important for answering questions such as how the materials are mixing in the mantle or how the slab subducts, and also how passive or active upwellings are happening in the earth. And it also controls the plate tectonics. So answering questions like why does Earth have plate tectonics, but other planets don't? So answering those kind of questions, we require understanding of mantle viscosity here. So overall, it's really important for understanding how the materials get recycled and mixed in the mantle, and also for a bigger question over time, how Earth thermally evolved through the geological timescale. And again, mantle viscosity is the key for answering that question. So you can try to study this from mineral physics point of view, basically trying to measure the resistance to flow for minerals. So what you would do is actually try to go and measure key properties of minerals at high pressure temperature conditions. And you can do this experimentally or also numerically. Now, from geophysical side, we have observation, and we can use that to infer the mantle viscosity. So what we would do is to see how Earth responds to different forcings or sources. So first inference of mantle viscosity was by Newton in 1687. So you can imagine if the rotation rate becomes faster, for example, Earth will try to flatten more. So by looking at how Earth responds to this change in rotation rate and how fast the flattening of the Earth is changing is giving you kind of idea about the bulk viscosity of the mantle. Nowadays, one of the most useful ways to constrain mantle viscosity comes from this thinking about the buoyancy structure in the mantle. So what we do is you can actually take seismic tomographic images of the mantle and think about the high velocity structure and take that as heavy, and low velocity structure as lighter materials. And you can impose that buoyancy structure in the mantle. And you can imagine surrounding mantle will actually flow in a way that's responding to this source. So by observing this deformation through gravity or geoid or even plate tectonics, you can try to infer the mantle viscosity. The other really useful way to infer viscosity is using glacier. So if you think about it, from the last glacial maximum, this ice mass has been shrinking at the Earth's surface. So again, mantle surrounding it is actually flowing, responding to the change in the surface mass. And we call this basically glacial isostatic adjustment. And using this, you can also infer the mantle viscosity. So there are numerous studies studying mantle viscosity. Just like I mentioned, GIA studies, there are many of them. And one of the critical limitation, I would say, there is that you have to assume certain ice history or distribution of the surface mass and how that's been changing over time. And that's one of the big assumptions because there's significant uncertainty associated with it. You can also look at the buoyancy structure and look at the gravity or geoid and so on. But again, you are making pretty big assumption converting seismic velocity structure into density structure. And there are also other studies combining different observables, gravity, plate motions, and also slab dynamics, sea level change, and so on. And at least if we look at some of the 1D viscosity structure that's constrained by these studies, what you notice is that there's actually pretty big range of 1D viscosity structure among these studies that are varying. At least you can probably summarize these structures into these three big boxes. So you have this blue part, which is basically the lithosphere that's strong, and you have upper mantle and then lower mantle here. So at least most of us think that there's increase in viscosity going from upper to lower mantle. And even within the upper mantle, there's actually a large variation in the viscosity structure that's inferred. So it would be really useful if we could add any additional constraints or any different observables to study mantle viscosity. And I'm going to argue throughout this talk that we could actually use post-seismic deformation from deep earthquakes to do so. So just to put everyone on the same page, let me briefly explain what postseismic deformation is. And this has been studied a lot for shallow earthquakes. So you see shallow earthquakes in the cartoon on the right here. And if you have observation point at the surface, for example, a GPS stations, and what will happen is this time series you see here, where we have time axis, and displacement is on the y-axis, and the dashed line and the star here marks the earthquake timing. And at the timing of the earthquake, you have this sudden motion, and that's what we call coseismic deformation. And the easiest way to think about this is to imagine a transform fault system or San Andreas fault system, where when you have earthquake, you might actually see the clear offset sometimes at the surface, and that's basically the coseismic displacement that you see there. Now, this coseismic displacement is followed by this time-dependent deformation, and that's what we call postseismic deformation. And one of the major mechanisms that cause postseismic deformation is viscoelastic relaxation. And that depends upon the viscosity structure of the mantle, let's say, that's close to the earthquakes. And if you think of those shallow earthquakes that you see on the right there, you can use this post-seismic deformation observation to try to study the viscosity structure of the shallow mantle. So then I thought, can we actually do the same, but for deep earthquakes? And by deep, I mean really deep, like 600-kilometer deep there, down there. Because if we can observe this, then this post-seismic deformation observed at the surface should be sensitive to the viscosity structure of much bigger range of the mantle. These earthquakes are happening right at the boundary, near the boundary of the upper and lower mantle. So you might be sensitive to the whole viscosity structure of the upper mantle and a bit of lower mantle as well, which will be really valuable information to have. Well, but now the challenge here is from the observation side. So can we actually see any surface deformation from these deep earthquakes? At least postseismic deformation would be probably easier to see because it's instantaneous. So it's easier to detect, and maybe they're larger in amplitude at a given time. And yeah, actually the answer is yes. For example, we had this 2013 magnitude 8.3 Sea of Okhotsk earthquake that happened at about 600-kilometer depth. And what you're looking at here are the GPS observed horizontal motion was associated with this earthquake. So you are looking at pretty clear co-seismic displacement at the surface. And if you look at the scale, you actually see centimeter or larger deformation displacements that's observed at the surface. So that's way beyond the resolution of the observation, meaning it's, yeah, very significant and it's really there. So that's basically the first GPS observation of any deformation from deep earthquakes, and that's actually the largest ever recorded deep earthquake ever so far. Well, now the question is, can we measure post-seismic deformation? When I had this idea, I was still, just trained as seismologist, and I was asking around geodesy experts at that time, and I didn't get actually very encouraging answers at that time. So because the earthquake is so far away from the surface, most of the people thought it would be probably unlikely that we will detect any of those gradual time-dependent motion. But I'm pretty happy to tell you throughout this talk that actually we now know that the answer is yes to this problem as well. And because we can measure and detect post-seismic deformation, we can now use that to constrain mantle viscosity structure. So let me get into the observation part. And to do that, I will use these GPS stations that are sitting at the surface. And for earthquake, I will use yet more recent large deep earthquake that happened in 2018, which is the magnitude 8.2 Fiji event that happened at about 560, 580 kilometer depth. So that's what you see in the beach ball there. And when this earthquake happened, I wasn't super hopeful about the data coverage because it happened in the middle of the ocean. However, I realized there are many volcanic islands that are out there, and they have actually good number of GPS stations that are operating there at the time of this earthquake, and we could actually utilize them. And actually, we ended up having pretty good data coverage. So we can actually take a look at one of the GPS station and look at the real data there. So we have 3-component time series here, east, north, and up component. And here again, the dashed line marks the timing of the earthquake. And what's encouraging here, at least, is that you see pretty clear co-seismic displacement. So in this station, in this location, basically you have eastward and also upward co-seismic motion that's observed. Now, of course, we are interested in post-seismic deformation. Can we find any post-seismic deformation here? Well, now you realize the real data is not as clean as what I just showed you earlier as a cartoon version. And that's because there are a lot of different sources of signals that are contributing to GPS data. So we have to use signal processing techniques, and here we are using independent component analysis. And what that allows us to do is to decompose the signal into different sources. So for example, if you look at this time series, you can actually decompose this time series into seasonal signal and also earthquake-related signal. So by using this type of technique, we could finally detect post-seismic deformation here So for me, that was probably the most exciting moment throughout this project. So what you're looking at here is the time evolution of the postseismic deformation from this deep earthquake. And this is actually a normalized time series, so it goes from 0 to 1. And what you notice here is the time evolution of this deformation does look kind of like what we know for the shallow earthquakes. So it does follow similar trend, like kind of like logarithmic trend over time here. And this is basically observing about 2 years long of signal since the earthquake occurred. Now, we can also look at how much of the signal is going on at each location of the GPS station. So you see a circle, each circle is GPS station, and the color of the circle is showing you the vertical displacement, cumulative displacement, where red, it means subsidence, and blue means uplift. And there's also horizontal motion that's depicted as the arrows. So sometimes actually you might notice there are multiple arrows coming out of one circle. That's just because there are actually multiple stations located at the same island or more or less the same location, and that's what you're looking at. So, for example, you see Tonga, there's Tonga Island here, and we actually see the largest subsidence there and also largest horizontal motion there. So we have largest motion that's observed there, and the subsidence is actually can be more than 2 centimeters. So it's actually quite significant motion there. And by the way, the yellow lines here are basically marking the slab depth contours. And now that we have this observation, we can go ahead and actually compare with some prediction or modeling to learn something about the mantle viscosity. So we can put this earthquake mechanism at its focal depth of 580 kilometer, and we need some mantle viscosity structure to do the modeling. And we can start with the simplest model, where upper mantle is about 10 to the 20 Pascal second, which is one of the most commonly used value. And here we have lower mantle that's about 20 times stronger than the upper mantle, which is, again, typical used value. Note that we are using a simple linear Maxwell rheology here. So in parentheses, you are seeing the Maxwell time as reference here. Now, we also know that all these deep earthquakes are actually happening within slabs, subducting slabs. So that's also something we can consider in our modeling and include it. Since slab is much stronger or higher viscosity structure here, and same as lithosphere, we are simply just modeling them as an elastic structure. But you could also try to model this with high viscosity, and it wouldn't actually change the result much at all. So let's start looking at this model and the modeling results. So that's exactly the model we just looked at. And if you do the modeling, the result looks something like this. Now you're looking at the map view. So earthquake is actually at the center here. And the gray line here is basically the trench location. We are actually trying to model the slab as close as possible to the realistic slab, as you see in the yellow lines there. Now you see somewhat faint blue and red colors there in the background, and that's basically predicted vertical displacements at about 2 years from the earthquakes. And there are actually arrows plotted also, which is almost like a dot because they are so small, but that's basically the horizontal motion that's predicted at the surface. So what this modeling result tells us is that if you don't have any weak zone or low viscosity structure in the system, you cannot really reproduce any significant amplitude signal observed at the surface. So we can actually go ahead and add a weak zone and see what happens. And we can do that, first of all, put the weak zone at the mantle transition zone. And we can do that because people have proposed that the minerals in the mantle transition zones tend to have higher water capacity, so they might actually hold more water, which might actually make your viscosity very low. So if we try that, the result looks something like this. And now we have pretty significant amplitude of postseismic displacements that's observed. That's comparable to our observation. So that's a good sign. But now one thing we were still curious about here at this point is whether we really need the slab in our modeling or not. And that's because we realize the weak zones are playing a big role because it's basically dominating the deformation process. So, and slab here is actually just a elastic or very high viscosity strong structure. So we didn't think that slab would have big effect on the post-seismic deformation pattern. And to our surprise, we actually tried this and realized it has really, really big effect. Not only it just slightly changes the, it's not just slight change in the deformation pattern, it's actually giving you almost complete opposite pattern. You can look at the color is different, and also arrows are pointing to almost the opposite directions compared to what you see on the top. At that time, this was really puzzling and counterintuitive for the reason I just explained, because we thought the weak structures are the most important ones that are dominating the deformation process. Now, my student, Chao Zhang, has been working on this, and we recently submitted this work, and he actually looked at how stress evolution pattern is really different when you have or not have the slab. So here, you're looking at depth cross-section. So now the vertical axis is depth, and here is basically a direction, east direction, or kind of trench perpendicular direction, you can say. And the color is showing you the stress, level of stress that's in logarithmic scale, and that's why you see some of the minus value contours here. So over time, if you don't have slab, this is the case, you don't have slab, here is the upper mantle and there's lower mantle, and earthquake is here. Over time, you actually see the stress actually decrease very efficiently, or it basically dissipates quite quickly. But if you have slab in the system, we learned that that's not the case. Basically, even if the same time has gone by, the stress level is still sustained, not only in the slab, but also outside outside the slab, meaning in the surrounding mantle. So it basically inhibits the slab stress relaxation process throughout the mantle, and it's playing a really big role in the post-seismic deformation process. And also, the stress is getting concentrated in the slab, which is also interesting feature to point out. So yeah, stay tuned for this work for the publication. And going back to our modeling, so now we know that slab, including slab, is crucial if you want to study post-seismic deformation from deep earthquakes. And if it wasn't the case, one could argue that we can just use simple 1D modeling because you don't have to include 3D structures like slab. But this means, our test means that if you want to study post-seismic deformation from deep earthquake, you do want to include the slab, and therefore you need 3D modeling scheme to basically reproduce all the features correctly. So from these modeling exercises, we've learned so far that weak zone is required and also slab is required. So knowing that, we can actually now keep including the slab and now play around with the weak zone location. So we can try, for example, putting the weak zone in the asthenosphere. And this is the result we get. I've mentioned earlier the Tonga station, which is right in front of the trench, has very big subsidence motion and also very big westward motion. And that's actually not something that this model could capture. So what this means is there's some preference for a deeper weak zone in the mantle. Knowing that mantle transition zone being weak better explains our observation, we can actually go further and divide the mantle transition zone in top and bottom half and see what happens. Are we even actually sensitive to these two different weak zones? So this is the modeling result for the top half of the mantle transition zone being weak. And this is the result when the bottom half of the mantle transition zone is weak. And you can see that the surface deformation pattern is actually quite different. You see way more subsidence actually around the earthquake here compared to the other case. So this means, yes, we are actually sensitive to weak zone location at this level, which is exciting. And next thing to think about is, okay, how sensitive are we to the viscosity value itself? So we can also test that, and we can take this model because so far among these models, this is so far the best fitting model, knowing that we mostly see subsidence around the source here. So let's take the model and just make the viscosity twice as stronger and see what happens. And this is what happened. So the overall pattern of the surface deformation stays more or less the same, but amplitude is about, becoming about half compared to the left. So viscosity basically controls the overall amplitude of the cumulative displacement, and it doesn't really change the pattern that much. So that's basically what we learn here. Okay, so we are sensitive to weak zone location and also the viscosity. So we can try to go ahead and find best fitting weak zone location and its viscosity. So we can do that in this plot. So here on one axis, we have weak zone location. And here I added a few more. We looked at asthenosphere earlier and mantle transition zone earlier. I also added a zone between asthenosphere and mantle transition zone, which I just named 220 to 410 because that's the depth of this range. And then we just talked about mantle transition zone, top half and bottom half of the zone. And we can further go and look at different thickness of the weak zone of 100 kilometer or 65 kilometer, which is half of the bottom half. So those are the weak zone locations we've tested. On the horizontal axis, we have Maxwell time, which is essentially the viscosity. So you can kind of just simply think of this axis as viscosity. And here, what I'm going to plot is the misfit to the spatial pattern or the cumulative displacement in three-component displacement. So if I do that for the top three cases for the weak zones, this is what we get. Just like what we looked at earlier, we do see preference for deeper weak zone being preferred because blue is the smaller misfit, so they explain the data better. Now, if we divide the mantle transition zone into top and bottom half, like we again saw earlier, bottom half is definitely preferred over top half. We can further refine and make the weak zone thinner. And we found that thinner weak zones require smaller viscosity to fit the model better. So that's why we're moving leftward here in this plot. And you can see that this corner is fitting the data the best so far. Now, that was looking at the misfit to the spatial pattern, we can also look at how these different models might fit the time evolution of the postseismic deformation. So we do exactly the same thing, and this is what we get. You tend to see bad fit to the data when the viscosity is too large, and basically what's happening there is the pattern look almost linear, not capturing this logarithmic evolution pattern. Again, this corner is better fitting our data, and those nicely capture this time evolution of logarithmic-like feature there. So we can combine those two different types of misfits, spatial pattern and the time evolution pattern. And as I mentioned, we are looking at the left bottom corner fitting the data the best. And by comparing actually the modeling result and the data one-to-one, we've decided that one of these models would be our preferred model, which is the 100-kilometer thick weak zone that's present between upper and lower mantle. And the viscosity value for that weak zone is about 4 to the 10 to the 17 Pascal second here. If we make comparison with the observation, one-on-one comparison with this model, this is what it looks like. So the larger circle here and the black arrows are the data that I already showed you, and the green arrows and also smaller circles you see here are from the model. So they're actually fitting the data pretty well, with also capturing the time evolution pretty well. So that's the fit to the data. So now that we know that observation really requires this relatively thin weak zone at the bottom of the upper mantle, we need to think about what's the mechanism, what can cause that kind of weak zone. Actually, many people have thought about this type of problem. And one of the ideas is involving phase transformation that's happening between upper and lower mantle. And that actually involves volumetric change during the phase transformation. And that can cause that sudden volumetric reduction can basically induce superplasticity, which will make the viscosity suddenly lower. So that could be one explanation. The other could be dehydration melting, because like I said earlier, the mantle transitions on mineral phases in that zone tends to hold maybe more water. And because of the discrepancy in the water capacity, when you transform from one form to the other form or different phases, you might actually end up generating melt. And that can actually really lower the viscosity significantly too. Finally, you can also actually have just a certain mineral phase that actually exists around that depth range, 550 to 520, 550 to 660-ish depth ranges. And for example, this cubic CaSiO3 phase is known to have lower viscosity. So that could be also an explanation for this kind of weak zone. I'm not trying to try to distinguish these mechanisms necessarily here, but what I want to stress here is that all of these mechanisms actually involve phase transformation or transition or certain phases, which is actually a global feature. Which is something that would happen globally throughout the mantle, not just in our study area. So even though our study area and the weak zone that's inferred here is limited to our regional study area, it's possible that the weak zone extends and actually might be more of a global feature. Another interesting thing to point out here is that if you have such weak zone, it can provide explanation for stagnant slabs. We know from seismic tomographic images that we do see this flattening or stagnant slabs around this upper and lower mantle boundary. However, from geodynamics side, it's actually quite hard to reproduce this feature by geodynamical modeling, but Mao and Zhong actually learned that if they actually have a low viscosity layer between upper and lower mantle, the stagnant slab feature becomes much easier to reproduce. So it's possible that you have this weak zone that's facilitating such a feature of stagnant slabs, which is, again, a feature that's not just happening in Tonga subduction zone, but it's happening in many other subduction zones. So it's possible that weak zones are present at other subduction zones as well. More recently, there's Grima et al. Also looked at this phenomenon, and they coined this term slab orphaning. It basically means during the subduction process, you have this small fragment of the slab that's detached from the rest of the subducting slab. And they actually also have found that this process, and you can actually observe this again in multiple subduction zones. For example, this is the same image I brought up earlier, but you can actually see that's happening in multiple subduction zones here too. And Grima et al. Learned that if you have weak zone or low viscosity zone between upper and lower mantle, again, this feature becomes much easier to reproduce. So again, this might be an evidence that such weak layer is more of a global feature than a regional feature near Tonga subduction zone. I can go and wrap up and say, most importantly, post-seismic deformation from deep earthquake has been observed now. And this provides us with new and independent approach for constraining viscosity. And from our modeling, we know that we are actually quite sensitive to weak zone location. And also we learned that including slab is really important. Also, based on our comparison of observation and modeling, we know that low viscosity layer at the bottom of the mantle transition zone is required to explain the observation. And this also provides explanation for stagnant slab or orphaning of slab, and therefore it might be more of a global feature than the regional feature. Now going further, Chow, again, my student, actually thought that it might be possible to go even further and try to constrain the mantle rheology, meaning distinguishing, for example, linear rheology versus power law rheology, let's say. I did mention earlier that my study was assuming linear rheology just simply. And I was actually skeptical that we could tell the difference between power law and linear rheology. But I was surprised to see that we actually might have significant sensitivity to tell apart the power law versus linear rheology for this deep part of the mantle. And it kind of makes sense because we are distinguishing these requires stress evolution that's quite different from, let's say, background stress. And you are basically perturbing stress at this deeper depth that you want to constrain the rheology for. So it looks like we have significant sensitivity to even go further and constrain the rheology. So yeah, please stay tuned for the results there. And finally, I think there are a lot to be done, a lot of exciting problems in what I call deep earthquake geodesy. geodesy community, the framework hasn't been really including deep earthquakes so much so far. But I think deep earthquakes can actually cause very significant changes in Earth's surface. And for example, my other student, Sifang Chen, is also working on the first order question of how large should a deep earthquake should be to be even observed, trying to understand the observation threshold and so on. So yeah, that's what we are currently working on. And I'll end my talk by saying that going after something that might not be observable at all actually can be fun and rewarding. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Park. That was a fascinating talk. I have a whole new appreciation for deep earthquakes.
Thank you.
So we're going to move into the Q&A portion now. So please, if you have any questions, type them into the Q&A box. Let's see, we have our first question here is, have you investigated the potential role of transient rheology in lieu of an apparent low viscosity layer near the MTZ?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So yeah, we can always think about short versus long-term viscosity there. Mantle convection time scale is really long compared to what we are considering. Even, GIA problem is way longer time scale than earthquake, which is like instantaneous almost stress perturbation in the system. So yes, it's possible that what we are seeing here, what we are sensitive to here is more of a transient rheology than much longer term rheology. So for example, this slide is just to show you that if you look at other, one of the viscosity profiles that's inferred using other observables that might be at much longer time scale, even when they infer similar low viscosity zones, it's already order or more different than what we are observing. So what the viscosity value we have here is very, very low. And yes, it's possible that we are more sensitive to transient rheology, transient part of the viscosity. Yes, thank you for asking that.
Okay, and then our next question asks, do you have an idea of how your modeling might change if you place earthquakes outside of the slab, such as via a thermal runaway mechanism?
Outside the slab. Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting question that's related to what Chao is working on, that I quickly alluded to here. So here I only showed you just one example of having or not having slab. So yes, we did test not having slab is actually not reproducing the observation very well, and you do need slab. One thing that Chao found is that it's really important for the earthquake to at least initiate or have most of the part in the slab. Interestingly, we found that connectivity of the slab is not super important in stress evolution. So you might have some earthquake that's happening in fragmented part of the slab, and that would still give you pretty similar result or similar stress evolution. So there's that. If you're talking about a case where, even when your rupture of the deep earthquakes that's going to go outside the slab, it would usually initiate still inside the slab, and your rupture would be close to the slab. We haven't actually tried to model where part of the rupture is in and part of the rupture is outside the slab. But yeah, so that's maybe something to be tested. But yeah, I will just answer in that, yeah, as long as you have good part of the rupture that's happening inside the slab, I think you'll have similar result as what you have most of the rupture inside the slab. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so next up we have, it says, recent geophysical observations suggest that the lithosphere-asthenosphere boundary, LAB, can be a weak low viscosity layer. Do you think the presence of such an LAB beneath the slab could contribute to the post-seismic deformation from deep earthquakes?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So actually, let's see. So it's not exactly LAB, but the whole asthenosphere, people has been inferring the viscosity of asthenosphere being pretty weak, and you can kind of consider LAB kind of, kind of weak zone at the similar location. And I've shown earlier that, let's see, I go back. Here, just having weak asthenosphere cannot explain the observation very well. Now, we are not arguing that we don't have weak zone at the asthenosphere or LAB depth. What happens if you have that in the system, you still basically, you can actually have both asthenosphere and weak zone at the bottom of the upper mantle and still reproduce the observation pretty well. What that means is that we are actually more sensitive to the viscosity structure at the deeper part of the mantle compared to the depth of asthenosphere or LAB. So yes, we are not ruling out LAB being weak, and we are tiny bit sensitive, but we're way more sensitive to deeper structure actually.
All right, this next question has two parts. So first, how do you explain that when the Earth is loaded from above, the loads of small lateral extent sensitive to the shallow mantle indicate a smaller viscosity than those of large lateral extent?
How to explain?
And if possible, if you can also in the Q&A clarify that question.
Yeah.
Then the next question is, how can we be sure that there is no afterslip on the same fault plane or on another one?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So I didn't have time to go into the aftersleep case here, but that's something we need to think about. So I only mentioned that viscoelastic relaxation is the main mechanism for the post-seismic deformation. But yeah, usually if we think about the shallow earthquakes, aftersleep is also can be major part of the post-seismic deformation. So we definitely consider that. And if you think about this cartoon here, what happens is if, let's say, there was an afterslip near this main shock, if you think of shallow earthquake and there's afterslip next to it, you would actually see quite different surface deformation pattern because the location is quite different, relative location is quite different between the two and the observation points. However, since you're so far away down there at 600 kilometer, what happens is even if aftersleep happens in the surrounding area, from the observation point of view at the surface, it's really almost like you're still looking at the point source, almost the same location. What that means is that if there was aftersleep present, the surface deformation pattern you would observe would be more or less the same as what you observe for post-seismic deformation pattern. So basically what we did was to actually examine the co-seismic deformation pattern, which we could detect, which is what you see on the top here, and compare that to the post-seismic deformation pattern. And we actually found that they're quite different. As you can see, there's much more uplift that's playing role, and actually there's more symmetry in the deformation with respect to the earthquake or epicenter, and that's not what we see in our observation, which means the viscoelastic relaxation is playing much bigger role here. And yeah, thanks for asking that really important question.
Okay, well, I have a question I'd like to ask. Do you observe differences in the time scales over which post-seismic deformation occurs in deep earthquakes versus shallow earthquakes?
Time scales. I think you can kind of pose that as like, if you you can always normalize the amplitude. So you can have in the same time scale sometimes have larger amplitude, maybe for shallow earthquakes and so on. But if I go back to this overall time evolution of the post-seismic deformation we see, I wouldn't say it's very different from shallow earthquakes. Not only the pattern is logarithmic, which is similar to what we see, but also overall time scale. It's actually 2 years here, but we later also looked at added data for 1+ years more, and it's basically still going just in a similar way as it would happen for shallow earthquakes. Thanks for asking.
I have one more question I can ask as well. I'm interested in, are there any situations in where tomography in the region would be useful for constraining your model layer structure options?
Yeah. Actually, let's see. If I go back to modeling and observation fit, that's what I showed you. And you actually can see there's still discrepancy between observation and the modeling result. So where could that discrepancy coming from? And we actually explored a lot of 3D structures that are possible in this study area. For example, that's actually motivated by seismic tomography images. So if I show you some examples, let's see. Yeah, this is actually not tomographic images, but people have suggested that in Tonga region, you might have quite weak mantle wedge, so much lower velocity mantle wedge. So we've also tested putting low viscosity structure in the mantle wedge, but it actually didn't improve the fit very much. The other thing we've considered is thinking about plume. People actually know that they have image seismically that there's some plume that's near the corner of the subducting slab. So we actually try to also model that. For example, this is kind of crude version of it, and it's hard to see, but for example, these short gray boxes are trying to represent the plume, weak viscosity zone. And again, it didn't fit the data better. So yes, we did try to consider other known structures in the system, but so far we haven't found a 3D structure that would actually improve our fit. Yes, thanks for asking that.
Okay, so it looks like we do have another question. We'll have time for probably another one after this as well, if there are any more. What is the magnitude of the largest aftershock in the same zone? And what do you think about its influence on your results?
That's a good question too. A lot of good questions. Yes, so it's really important to think about not only the aftershock, but also other earthquakes that might be happening around this area. So I kind of skipped over this, but the data processing part is actually quite important. So what we do is actually knowing that there are these shocks, and just to answer the question directly, there was this pretty big aftershock, magnitude 7.9 deep earthquake that happened about a month later. So knowing that these timing and location of these earthquakes from seismic data, we actually went ahead when we processed the GPS data, we actually disentangle any signals that are possibly coming from these other earthquakes. Yeah, so thanks for asking that.